During the late 1960s, the Phuoc Tuy province in South Vietnam presented a formidable challenge to the Australian armed forces stationed at the Nui Dat base. The dense tropical jungle environment was characterized by its oppressive humidity, thick vegetation, and unforgiving terrain. This landscape provided a perfect operational theater for the Viet Cong guerrilla units. The insurgents utilized a sophisticated mastery of hit-and-run tactics, effectively vanishing into the dense foliage after launching sudden attacks. Traditional infantry patrols frequently found themselves reacting to unseen threats, struggling to maintain a definitive tactical advantage against an elusive enemy. Conventional tracking methods employed by the Australian infantry often proved inadequate within this specific theater of war. The guerrilla forces were exceptionally skilled at masking their physical footprints, utilizing the natural canopy and complex river systems to break their trails. A regular soldier, heavily burdened by essential combat gear and reliant primarily on human eyesight, was at a severe disadvantage. The dense undergrowth concealed subtle environmental disturbances, and the constant threat of lethal booby traps forced patrols to move at a painfully slow and cautious pace. The military command urgently required a specialized tactical solution to counter this significant operational vulnerability. To address this critical tactical deficiency, the Australian military introduced a specialized capability into the jungle theater, the tracker dog teams. Recognizing that human senses were vastly inferior to the olfactory capabilities of canines, they deployed extensively trained dogs paired with dedicated human handlers. These specialized teams were integrated into standard infantry patrols to serve as a vital sensory extension. The primary mission of these canine units was not aggressive combat, but rather silent reconnaissance and precise scent tracking. This strategic implementation marked a significant tactical shift, directly challenging the insurgents' primary advantage of stealth and environmental concealment. Corporal Thomas Miller, a seasoned handler renowned for his disciplined professionalism, was at the forefront of this new tactical deployment. His military bearing was defined by an acute understanding of jungle warfare and an unwavering commitment to operational procedure. Beside him operated Caesar, an exceptionally intelligent black Labrador retriever bred specifically for tracking and reconnaissance operations. Caesar possessed a preternaturally sensitive olfactory system, honed through rigorous training programs back in Australia. The bond between the corporal and the military working dog was forged through hundreds of hours of repetitive drills, creating a seamless and highly effective tactical partnership. Upon their initial arrival at the Nui Dat combat base, both the handler and the canine faced an immediate and grueling acclimatization process. The overwhelming tropical heat and suffocating humidity drained their physical endurance rapidly during their first exploratory patrols. Caesar had to adjust not only to the oppressive climate, but also to an entirely new olfactory environment. The Vietnamese jungle was a chaotic symphony of exotic odors, including rotting vegetation, pungent tropical wildlife, and unfamiliar agricultural scents. Corporal Miller understood that his partner needed crucial time to filter out the natural background noise of the dense ecosystem. During these critical early weeks, Corporal Miller focused intensely on calibrating Caesar to the specific scent profiles of the local insurgent forces. They conducted numerous simulated tracking exercises within the secure perimeter before venturing into hostile territory. "You have to learn the smell of their equipment, boy," Tom would mutter quietly while presenting the dog with captured enemy artifacts. Caesar learned to identify the distinct chemical signatures of uniform fabrics, specific types of weapon oils, and the unique odors associated with indigenous diets. This specialized conditioning was absolute paramount for achieving operational success during highly dangerous jungle deployments. A fundamental requirement of their tactical operation was the maintenance of absolute silence while moving through the dense foliage. Unlike traditional police canine units that might bark to indicate a discovery, a tracker dog in a combat zone had to remain completely mute. Any vocalization would instantly compromise the patrol's position, inviting a lethal ambush from hidden enemy forces. Corporal Miller and Caesar communicated entirely through subtle physical cues, utilizing a sophisticated language of harness tension and subtle head movements. This silent coordination required an extraordinary level of mutual trust and intense focus from both the man and the dog. When Caesar detected a relevant scent trail, his entire physical demeanor would undergo a noticeable and immediate transformation. The relaxed posture of a walking dog would instantly vanish, replaced by a rigid, hyper-focused stance of intense concentration. His breathing would change rapidly as he aggressively processed the airborne particles, drawing the faint chemical signatures deep into his specialized olfactory receptors. Corporal Miller learned to read these subtle shifts with absolute precision, immediately halting the patrol with a raised hand signal. "Good boy, stay focused," the handler would whisper internally, feeling the sudden, purposeful tension radiating through the connecting harness. The true test of their capabilities commenced during a routine reconnaissance mission deep into the heart of the contested rubber plantations and surrounding jungle. The infantry platoon moved in a standard staggered column formation, with Corporal Miller and Caesar positioned carefully near the front of the advancing line. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, heavy with the ever-present anticipation of sudden enemy contact or concealed explosive devices. The thick canopy above effectively blocked out the harsh sunlight, casting the jungle floor in a perpetual state of eerie, emerald twilight. Every rustling leaf and snapping twig amplified the profound sense of danger. As the patrol navigated through an area previously suspected of high insurgent activity, Caesar suddenly exhibited a dramatic change in behavior. His nose dropped steadily toward the damp earth, moving methodically from side to side in a deliberate sweeping motion. Corporal Miller immediately tightened his grip on the leather leash, his tactical awareness instantly heightened by the dog's obvious reaction. He signaled the platoon commander behind him, confirming that the canine had successfully acquired a fresh scent trail. The entire unit instantly transitioned into a high-alert tactical posture, weapons raised and eyes scanning the dense surrounding foliage for potential threats. The scent trail Caesar had intercepted was invisible to the human eye, devoid of any traditional physical signs of recent passage. There were no broken branches, no displaced mud, and absolutely no discarded equipment visible on the jungle floor. Yet, the black Labrador pulled forward with an unmistakable sense of localized purpose, navigating the complex terrain with absolute confidence. The dog was meticulously following a microscopic path of lingering body odors, microscopic skin cells, and disturbed earth trapped securely beneath the thick layer of rotting foliage. It was a biological tracking mechanism that completely bypassed the enemy's visual camouflage techniques. Corporal Miller carefully observed the environment as they followed the dog's relentless lead deeper into the unforgiving vegetation. He marveled at how Caesar effortlessly bypassed several deceptive physical trails that would have easily misdirected a standard human tracker. The insurgent forces had clearly attempted to mask their withdrawal by executing complex maneuvering tactics, stepping on exposed roots and hard rocks. However, these rudimentary visual deception techniques were entirely useless against the sophisticated olfactory analysis conducted by the trained canine. The dog simply followed the airborne chemical reality, completely ignoring the deliberately manufactured visual lies left behind on the ground. The physical exertion required to maintain this intense level of focus tracking was immense for both the handler and the canine. The suffocating heat of the Vietnamese afternoon relentlessly battered their bodies, causing sweat to pour profusely beneath their heavy combat equipment. Corporal Miller ensured they took frequent, brief tactical pauses, carefully administering measured amounts of vital water from his specialized canteen to Caesar. "Keep pushing, mate. We are closing the distance," Tom whispered encouragingly, gently stroking the dog's damp neck during a brief halt. Maintaining the animal's physical hydration and psychological motivation was crucial for sustaining the arduous pursuit. The presence of the tracker team significantly altered the psychological dynamic of the entire infantry platoon during these dense jungle operations. The soldiers experienced a profound reduction in their chronic anxiety regarding sudden, unseen ambushes from the surrounding foliage. They quickly developed a deep reliance on the canine's superior sensory capabilities, trusting the animal's instincts far more than their own limited vision. The silent, methodical progression of the black Labrador at the front of the column provided a crucial layer of tactical reassurance. This increased confidence allowed the infantry unit to move with greater deliberate speed and focused operational efficiency. After several hours of relentless tracking, Caesar led the patrol directly into a small, recently evacuated insurgent jungle encampment. The site had been expertly camouflaged from aerial observation and meticulously cleaned of obvious physical evidence prior to the enemy's departure. However, the residual olfactory signatures of human occupation, cooking fires, and weapon maintenance were overwhelmingly clear to the tracking dog. Corporal Miller formally reported the successful discovery to the platoon commander, validating the precise accuracy of the canine's extended pursuit. This successful operational verification firmly cemented the tracker dog team's indispensable value within the broader context of the tactical unit. The intelligence gathered from this concealed location proved highly valuable to the broader Australian operational strategy in the immediate region. Although the guerrilla fighters had successfully relocated, the specific routing of their departure trail provided critical tactical information regarding their movement patterns. Caesar enthusiastically continued to investigate the perimeter, his nose vigorously confirming the exact directional vector of the retreating enemy forces. The commander decided to halt the direct pursuit for the day, prioritizing the detailed analysis of the discovered encampment. They had successfully demonstrated their new capability to reliably pierce the enemy's previously impenetrable veil of absolute jungle secrecy. The return journey to the Nui Dat military installation was conducted with the same rigorous tactical discipline and cautious observation. Corporal Miller and Caesar remained highly vigilant, fully understanding that the enemy frequently monitored the withdrawal routes of coalition forces. Upon successfully re-entering the secure perimeter of the base, the immense physical exhaustion finally washed over the dedicated tracking team. The handler immediately prioritized the thorough grooming and necessary medical inspection of his invaluable canine partner before attending to his own needs. Ensuring the dog's continued physical health was the most critical responsibility of any professional military animal handler. During the comprehensive intelligence debriefing, the operational command staff expressed significant interest in the precise details of the tracker team's performance. Corporal Miller provided a highly objective, professional assessment of Caesar's behavioral responses and the overall effectiveness of the tracking methodology. He emphasized that while the canine capability was indeed extraordinary, it required careful tactical integration and realistic operational expectations. The dog is a highly sophisticated sensor, not a miraculous weapon, the corporal explained to the gathered officers. This grounded, realistic evaluation was essential for refining their future deployment strategies and maximizing their combat effectiveness against the elusive insurgents. The successful implementation of this new tactical paradigm signaled a definitive shift in the operational dynamics of the regional conflict. The Australian forces were no longer entirely blind when operating within the dense, seemingly impenetrable confines of the tropical jungle environment. They now possessed a reliable biological mechanism to actively hunt down the guerrilla units, systematically dismantling their previously unchallenged dominance of stealth. The tracker dogs essentially transformed the vast, concealing wilderness from a completely safe haven for the enemy into a highly contested battleground. This represented a fundamental disruption of the established strategic balance within the designated operational theater. Simultaneously, intelligence reports began to indicate that the Viet Cong forces were becoming acutely aware of this dangerous new battlefield capability. Intercepted communications and reports from captured prisoners revealed a growing institutional anxiety regarding the deployment of the Australian canine units. The insurgents realized that their traditional methods of visual evasion and trail masking were becoming rapidly obsolete against this unique threat. They understood that the dogs could ruthlessly expose their hidden positions and relentlessly pursue them through the most difficult terrain imaginable. A deep, psychological fear was beginning to take root among the previously highly confident guerrilla fighters. As night descended upon the fortified military base, Corporal Miller sat quietly beside Caesar's enclosure, reflecting on the day's intense operation. He recognized the immense tactical responsibility resting upon his shoulders and the extraordinary capabilities of the silent animal sleeping peacefully nearby. They had successfully proven their operational concept, but he knew the war was continuously evolving and the enemy would inevitably adapt. He meticulously cleaned his combat gear, mentally preparing himself for the inevitable challenges that the unforgiving jungle environment would present tomorrow. The bond between the professional soldier and his dedicated dog was their absolute greatest asset. This conflict was fundamentally unlike any conventional war previously fought by the Australian armed forces, requiring constant, innovative tactical adaptation. The dense, oppressive jungle environment dictated the unique terms of engagement, strictly punishing any reliance on outdated military doctrines or inflexible strategies. The introduction of the tracker dog teams was a brilliant, pragmatic response to these incredibly harsh and demanding environmental realities. It was a clear demonstration of military ingenuity, utilizing the oldest of human alliances to decisively solve a uniquely The silent war beneath the thick tropical canopy had permanently entered a completely new phase. Tomorrow would undoubtedly bring further grueling patrols, deeper incursions into hostile territory, and increasingly complex tactical challenges for the tracking unit. Corporal Miller understood that the enemy command structure would actively attempt to develop specific countermeasures to neutralize their unique tracking capabilities. They would undoubtedly face deliberately confusing scent trails, sophisticated chemical masking attempts, and potentially targeted ambushes designed specifically to eliminate the dogs. The handler remained stoically determined, absolutely confident in the rigorous training regimen and the profound, unbreakable connection he shared with Caesar. They were fully prepared to relentlessly confront whatever hidden dangers lurked within the dense foliage. The tactical shift had been successfully initiated, irrevocably altering the complex operational landscape of the Phuoc Tuy province for both sides. The Australian infantry forces now possessed the critical capability to actively, aggressively pursue the previously elusive shadows lurking within the jungle. The Viet Cong could no longer completely rely on the vast, dense wilderness to guarantee their absolute safety and strategic concealment. The silent, relentless pursuit by the highly trained dogs had officially begun, setting the stage for a truly unprecedented and terrifying form of psychological warfare. The true test of survival for both factions was now definitively underway. Nguyen Van Hai was a highly seasoned commander within the local Viet Cong guerrilla forces operating throughout the dense Phuoc Tuy province. His extensive military survival expertise was forged through years of relentless asymmetric warfare against technologically superior adversaries. Hai possessed an intimate, almost instinctual understanding of the unforgiving tropical jungle environment. He viewed the dense, tangled vegetation not as a hostile obstacle, but as a crucial tactical ally, providing absolute concealment. His primary combat doctrine relied heavily on rapid, unexpected strikes, followed immediately by a rapid, untraceable withdrawal into the surrounding impenetrable wilderness. To ensure the complete survival of his designated guerrilla unit, Hai enforced a rigorously disciplined approach to tactical evasion and trail obfuscation. His soldiers were meticulously trained to step carefully on exposed roots and solid rocks, deliberately avoiding leaving any compressible footprints in the soft mud. They frequently employed the arduous technique of walking backward for considerable distances to deliberately disorient any pursuing enemy infantry trackers. "We must become invisible, like ghosts dissolving into the morning mist," Hai would sternly remind his exhausted men during their highly calculated and silent operational retreats through the jungle. Another fundamental aspect of their standard evasion protocol involved the careful physical manipulation of the immediate surrounding jungle foliage. A designated soldier at the rear of the retreating column was strictly tasked with meticulously brushing away any disturbed leaves or broken twigs. Using a freshly cut palm frond, this individual effectively erased the subtle visual indicators of human passage from the damp earth. This painstaking process significantly slowed their overall movement speed, but Hai firmly believed that absolute visual deception was paramount. They successfully rendered their physical escape routes practically invisible to the human eye. Waterways provided another critical tactical advantage for Hai and his disciplined guerrilla fighters during their calculated, evasive maneuvers. Whenever their operational path intersected with a flowing stream or a shallow jungle river, the entire unit would immediately wade directly into the moving water. They would deliberately travel upstream or downstream for several hundred meters before carefully exiting onto the opposite rocky bank. This traditional anti-tracking technique was specifically designed to completely break the visual continuity of their physical trail. Historically, this method had consistently proven highly successful against conventional Allied infantry patrols operating in the region. Following a remarkably successful harassment ambush against a remote Allied supply convoy, Hai immediately initiated his standard withdrawal procedures. The guerrilla unit vanished quickly into the dense vegetation, strictly adhering to their practiced techniques of absolute silence and physical trail obfuscation. They carefully navigated through a particularly treacherous section of thorny bamboo, intentionally choosing the most difficult terrain to discourage any rapid enemy pursuit. The suffocating afternoon heat heavily oppressed the retreating soldiers, but their commander relentlessly pushed them forward. Hai remained confident that their meticulously erased tracks would permanently confound any conventional infantry pursuit. For the first few hours of their arduous retreat, a familiar sense of tactical security were gradually settled over the exhausted guerrilla unit. They had flawlessly executed their complex anti-tracking maneuvers, carefully utilizing a shallow creek bed to effectively mask their directional vector. The dense jungle canopy completely obscured their precise location from any hostile aerial reconnaissance aircraft patrolling the skies above. Hai briefly allowed his men a crucial moment of rest deep within a heavily concealed ravine, satisfied with their disciplined performance. He methodically calculated the extended distance they had successfully placed between themselves and the enemy forces. However, this comforting illusion of absolute safety was suddenly shattered by the alarming report of a highly observant rear-guard sentry. The young soldier breathlessly approached his commander, his face pale with an unfamiliar sense of profound anxiety. "Comrade Commander, the enemy is aggressively closing the distance, and they are moving directly along our exact path," the sentry whispered urgently. This startling intelligence directly contradicted everything Hai mathematically understood about the established limitations of Allied visual tracking capabilities. The pursuing forces were maintaining an impossibly accurate trajectory through the dense, visually unbroken jungle environment. Hai initially dismissed the panicked report as the predictable paranoia of a physically exhausted and combat-stressed young recruit. It was logically impossible for heavily burdened Allied infantrymen to visually track their carefully masked movements with such sustained speed. He aggressively ordered a sudden, sharp deviation in their established travel route, deliberately crossing through a dense thicket of incredibly sharp elephant grass. This brutal terrain would undoubtedly leave subtle visual marks, but it would simultaneously force the pursuers to slow down significantly. The commander intended to utilize this newly created distance to effectively disappear once again. Despite their exhausting efforts to drastically alter their course, the deeply unsettling reality of the situation rapidly became undeniable to everyone. The distant, rhythmic sounds of the approaching Allied patrol continued to echo ominously through the dense tropical foliage. The pursuers were decisively cutting through the complex jungle terrain with a terrifyingly accurate sense of absolute directional purpose. They were completely ignoring the deliberately misleading visual clues that Hai had strategically orchestrated along their secondary escape route. The guerrilla commander realized with mounting dread that their traditional evasion doctrines were fundamentally failing against this specific enemy unit. The terrifying truth finally materialized when an advanced scout successfully observed the pursuing Australian patrol from a highly concealed, elevated position. The scout hastily retreated to inform Hai of a shocking tactical development that fundamentally altered their operational reality. "They are not looking at the ground, Commander. They are eagerly following a large black dog that is sniffing the air," the scout reported with visible trembling. This crucial piece of intelligence instantly illuminated the catastrophic failure of their meticulous visual camouflage techniques. The enemy was completely bypassing their optical deceptions and aggressively tracking their invisible chemical signatures. Hai experienced a profound, chilling realization regarding the absolute vulnerability of his seasoned troops in this newly redefined battlefield environment. He understood that every single drop of human sweat, every lingering metallic odor of weapon oil, constituted a brightly illuminated highway for the animal. The microscopic biological particles constantly shedding from their exhausted bodies created a persistent olfactory trail that hung heavily in the stagnant, humid jungle air. Their practiced backward walking and meticulously brushed footprints were utterly meaningless against a biological sensor actively processing these invisible, airborne chemical markers. Their physical stealth had been entirely neutralized. The psychological impact of this terrifying revelation immediately began to heavily erode the previously unshakable morale of the hardened guerrilla unit. The profound realization that an unseen animal could intimately smell their lingering fear and physical exhaustion was profoundly demoralizing. Soldiers who had bravely faced heavy artillery barrages now cast deeply paranoid glances into the impenetrable shadows surrounding them. The suffocating jungle, previously considered their absolute sanctuary, suddenly felt like an inescapably claustrophobic cage slowly closing around them. The invisible tether connecting them to the relentlessly pursuing black dog generated a persistent, agonizing mental pressure upon the troops. In a desperate tactical attempt to actively sever this terrifying invisible connection, Hai ordered his men to employ aggressive chemical countermeasures. The soldiers hastily scattered generous quantities of crushed black pepper and pungent locally sourced chili powder directly across their newly established trail. They desperately hoped that these harsh, organic substances would severely irritate the sensitive olfactory membranes of the pursuing canine and effectively disable its tracking capabilities. This hasty biological defense strategy represented a frantic improvisation, born directly from their rapidly escalating fear of the relentlessly advancing Australian patrol. Unfortunately for the exhausted insurgents, these hastily deployed chemical deterrents proved to be completely ineffective against the highly trained Australian tracking team. While the pungent spices might have momentarily distracted a regular canine, Caesar had been rigorously conditioned to effectively ignore such crude environmental anomalies. The Black Labrador simply bypassed the contaminated zone, expanding his search radius slightly until he quickly reacquired the pure human scent vector. The relentless pursuit continued, without any significant interruption, methodically closing the tactical distance between the heavily armed Australian soldiers and the increasingly desperate guerrilla fighters. Driven by sheer tactical desperation, Hai directed his heavily exhausted unit into a treacherous, fast-flowing river, demanding they wade against the strong current. They remained submerged waist-deep in the murky water for over an hour, enduring the freezing temperatures and the constant threat of dangerous aquatic leeches. The commander firmly believed that this extended aquatic maneuver would finally wash away their lingering bodily odors and decisively break the persistent scent trail. They carefully exited the river onto a solid expanse of exposed bedrock, leaving absolutely no physical indicators of their precise departure point. Despite their agonizing physical endurance in the freezing water, the relentless Australian tracking team eventually arrived at the exact edge of the riverbank. Corporal Miller calmly observed the flowing water, patiently allowing Caesar the necessary time to systematically analyze the complex surrounding air currents. The highly trained dog moved methodically along the muddy bank, his sensitive nose actively processing the microscopic scent particles carried gently by the afternoon breeze. Suddenly, the canine's posture stiffened dramatically, firmly indicating that he had successfully detected the faint residual odor of the guerrilla fighters on the distant opposite shore. Observing this impossible tracking feat from a distant, highly concealed vantage point, Commander Hai finally accepted the grim reality of their current tactical situation. The Australian forces had successfully deployed a biological weapon that effectively rendered decades of refined guerrilla evasion tactics completely obsolete. We can successfully deceive the eyes of our enemies, but we absolutely cannot hide our breath from that cursed animal, Hai whispered bitterly to his deputy. This profound acknowledgement marked a permanent, fundamental shift in how the Viet Cong would have to conduct their future military operations within this specific province. The immediate operational priority for the guerrilla unit was no longer a simple tactical withdrawal, but rather an absolute desperate fight for physical survival. Hai realized that merely running away was completely futile. The relentless tracking dog would eventually guide the heavily armed Australian infantry directly to their exact location. He needed to radically alter his entire defensive strategy, shifting rapidly from passive evasion techniques to highly aggressive, direct confrontation. If they could not successfully lose the pursuing animal in the dense jungle, they would have to actively attempt to eliminate the immediate threat itself. The exhausted commander forcefully rallied his demoralized troops, explicitly demanding their absolute focus for a highly dangerous, impending tactical maneuver. He meticulously selected a heavily fortified defensive position located strategically along a narrow, inescapable jungle choke point. The guerrilla fighters began desperately preparing a complex network of lethal, interlocking firing zones, specifically designed to instantly annihilate the advancing tracking team. They understood perfectly that their very survival depended entirely upon the absolute success of this newly devised, incredibly desperate counter-ambush strategy. The dense jungle waited in breathless anticipation for the inevitable, violent collision of these opposing forces. As the guerrilla fighters meticulously camouflaged their newly established firing positions, a heavy, oppressive silence descended completely over the tense jungle environment. The previously familiar sounds of the tropical forest now seemed inherently threatening, every rustling leaf potentially masking the silent approach of the black dog. The psychological warfare inflicted by the unseen canine had successfully fractured their fundamental sense of operational security within their own territory. They gripped their loaded weapons with sweating palms, silently praying that their carefully constructed ambush would permanently neutralize the terrifying biological sensor relentlessly hunting them down. The fundamental dynamic of the prolonged jungle conflict had been irreversibly altered by the successful introduction of this highly specialized tracking capability. The Viet Cong forces, previously the undisputed masters of the vanishing act, were now firmly trapped in a relentless, terrifyingly accurate pursuit. The invisible chemical trails they inadvertently left behind had successfully become their ultimate tactical vulnerability in the unforgiving tropical environment. As the Australian patrol systematically closed the remaining distance, the stage was definitively set for a brutal, decisive confrontation hidden deep beneath the thick, emerald canopy of the impenetrable rainforest. Commander Hai meticulously selected a precarious choke point along a narrow, winding jungle trail to execute his desperate ambush. The dense vegetation on either side formed an impenetrable physical barrier, perfectly funneling any advancing hostile forces directly into his meticulously established kill zone. His seasoned guerrilla fighters expertly camouflaged their entrenched firing positions, using freshly cut foliage and dark mud. They remained perfectly motionless in the oppressive heat, their fingers resting lightly on the cold metal triggers of their automatic weapons. Hai silently calculated the exact optimal moment to initiate the devastating crossfire that would annihilate the tracking team. Several hundred meters away, the heavily armed Australian infantry patrol continued its methodical advance through the suffocating tropical undergrowth. Corporal Thomas Miller walked point, his senses hyper-tuned to the subtle environmental shifts occurring within the dense jungle canopy. Caesar, the black Labrador, moved silently just ahead of his handler, constantly analyzing the invisible chemical landscape with his highly sensitive olfactory system. The dog's specialized tracking harness connected them both physically and psychologically, allowing Tom to instantly feel the slightest hesitation or sudden acceleration in the animal's purposeful stride. They were hunting an increasingly desperate and dangerous enemy force. The dense jungle atmosphere grew increasingly heavy and stagnant as the tracking team systematically approached the designated ambush coordinates. Caesar's regular tracking behavior began to subtly shift, indicating a significant change in the airborne chemical signatures he was actively processing. He was no longer merely following the residual scent of decaying sweat left upon the damp earth hours ago. The highly trained canine was now beginning to detect the fresh, potent odor of human adrenaline and freshly oiled weaponry carried faintly on the completely still tropical air. A sudden, dangerous proximity was becoming rapidly apparent to the dog. Without any audible warning, Caesar abruptly ceased his forward movement, his entire muscular frame instantly locking into a rigid, highly focused posture. The dog's nose elevated slightly, pointing directly toward the seemingly empty wall of green vegetation situated approximately 50 meters ahead. He did not bark or growl, strictly adhering to his rigorous military conditioning regarding absolute silence during combat operations. Instead, the hair along his spine stood erect, and his tail stiffened unnaturally. This was the precise, unmistakable physical manifestation of the silent alert that Corporal Miller had been rigorously trained to instantly recognize and explicitly trust. Corporal Miller immediately dropped to a low crouch, simultaneously raising his right hand in a sharp, decisive tactical gesture to halt the advancing infantry column. The seasoned Australian soldiers behind him instantly froze in their tracks, silently melting into the surrounding dense foliage to establish defensive perimeters. "Hold the line. The dog has something immediate," Tom whispered softly into his tactical radio, his eyes scanning the seemingly peaceful jungle path ahead. He carefully observed Caesar's rigid stance, noting the exact directional vector the animal's nose was indicating. The dog had clearly detected a highly localized, stationary human presence. The experienced handler quickly analyzed the tactical implications of the dog's specific behavioral response within this dangerously narrow jungle corridor. The enemy forces were no longer actively retreating. They had deliberately stopped and were currently waiting in a concealed, forward-facing position. The pungent scent of fresh adrenaline suggested a heightened state of immediate combat readiness among the hidden insurgents. Tom realized with chilling certainty that they were standing directly on the absolute precipice of a meticulously coordinated enemy ambush. If they had advanced even 20 meters further without the dog, the entire lead element would have been decimated. Tom carefully retreated a few paces, gently guiding the tense Labrador back toward the relative safety of a massive, fallen mahogany tree. The musa-plated commander silently crawled forward to Tom's concealed position, his face grim with the sudden realization of their extreme proximity to lethal danger. "Caesar is indicating a strong, stationary presence directly ahead, sir, likely an entrenched ambush covering the choke point," the corporal reported in a hushed, strictly professional tone. The commanding officer nodded slowly, peering intently into the deceptive wall of green vegetation that completely hid the waiting Viet Cong guerrilla fighters from their human vision. Relying entirely upon the precise intelligence provided silently by the tracking dog, the Australian commanding officer rapidly formulated an alternative tactical maneuver. A direct frontal assault into a prepared enemy kill zone was a fundamentally flawed doctrine that would inevitably result in catastrophic military casualties. Instead, he ordered a heavily armed maneuver element to silently detach from the main column and slowly flank the suspected enemy positions through the dense, unforgiving undergrowth. They would utilize the element of surprise to effectively counter the insurgents' carefully laid trap, aggressively turning the psychological tables on the heavily entrenched guerrilla fighters. As the designated flanking team began their agonizingly slow and silent progression through the dense tropical thicket, Tom and Caesar remained completely stationary. Their primary mission was to continuously monitor the static scent picture, ensuring the concealed enemy forces did not suddenly alter their tactical positions. The black Labrador remained hyper-focused, his sensitive nose actively parsing the subtle shifts in the gentle jungle breeze for any new developments. Corporal Miller gently stroked the dog's flanks, silently praising the animal for successfully identifying the lethal threat before the infantry patrol had unknowingly blundered into the devastating, pre-planned crossfire. From his highly concealed vantage point, overlooking the narrow jungle trail, Commander High experienced a growing sense of profound, uncomfortable anxiety. According to his meticulous mathematical calculations, the pursuing Australian infantry patrol should have walked directly into his carefully prepared kill zone several minutes ago. The dense, oppressive silence of the tropical forest was completely unbroken by the anticipated heavy footfalls of the advancing enemy soldiers. His disciplined guerrilla fighters remained perfectly still, but the prolonged, agonizing wait was rapidly eroding their combat focus and significantly increasing their psychological stress levels in the suffocating heat. A deeply unsettling realization gradually began to form within the experienced guerrilla commander's highly tactical and analytical mind. The enemy forces had inexplicably halted their aggressive advance just outside the effective range of his unit's concealed automatic weapons. The only logical explanation for this sudden tactical pause was that their sophisticated biological sensor had successfully detected the ambush from a safe distance. The invisible canine had somehow smelled their static presence, completely neutralizing the critical element of surprise that was absolutely essential for the operational success of their desperate defensive strategy. The perfect trap had completely failed. Before High could issue a rapid command to safely abort the compromised ambush and initiate a tactical withdrawal, the dense jungle abruptly erupted into chaotic violence. The Australian flanking element had successfully navigated the thick underbrush, forcefully striking the exposed right flank of the entrenched Viet Cong defensive line. Heavy automatic gunfire tore violently through the carefully constructed camouflage, instantly shattering the oppressive silence of the tropical afternoon. The guerrilla fighters, intensely focused entirely on the empty trail directly ahead of them, were caught completely off guard by the devastating assault originating from an entirely unexpected operational direction. The meticulously planned kill zone instantly transformed into a chaotic, desperate struggle for immediate physical survival, as the insurgents desperately attempted to reposition their weapons. The Australian forces laid down a massive volume of highly accurate suppressive fire, effectively pinning the confused guerrilla unit against the impenetrable wall of jungle vegetation. Commander Hai shouted frantic tactical orders over the deafening roar of the intense firefight, realizing that his defensive position had become a lethal trap for his own men. The tactical advantage had shifted completely and violently in favor of the heavily armed Allied infantry patrol. Recognizing the absolute futility of maintaining their compromised defensive positions against the aggressive flanking maneuver, Hai forcefully ordered an immediate, chaotic withdrawal. The guerrilla fighters abandoned their carefully constructed fighting holes, desperately scrambling backward into the dense, forgiving darkness of the deeper jungle terrain. They left behind a significant amount of essential combat equipment and valuable ammunition in their frantic haste to safely escape the devastating Allied assault. The profound psychological shock of having their perfect ambush completely dismantled by an unseen tracking dog heavily compounded their physical exhaustion as they blindly fled through the unforgiving tropical wilderness. Following the rapid, chaotic retreat of the insurgent forces, the intense jungle firefight gradually subsided into a tense, heavily armed silence. The Australian platoon carefully secured the abandoned enemy positions, meticulously clearing the immediate area of any potential lethal booby traps or lingering threats. Corporal Miller and Caesar slowly advanced into the newly secured perimeter, the Black Labrador immediately beginning to actively investigate the pungent odors of recently discharged cordite and discarded equipment. The dog's earlier silent alert had unequivocally saved the lives of numerous infantrymen who would have otherwise marched directly into a devastating enemy crossfire. The Australian platoon commander approached Corporal Miller, his expression reflecting a profound sense of genuine gratitude and professional military respect. "That animal just prevented a catastrophic disaster today, Corporal. We were walking completely blind into a highly sophisticated meat grinder," the officer stated with absolute conviction. Tom simply nodded, gently patting the dog's solid shoulder. "He just did his job, sir. He read the air and told us exactly what was waiting in the shadows," the handler replied modestly. The entire infantry unit now possessed an unwavering, absolute belief in the incredible tactical capabilities of the tracking team. Caesar showed absolutely no interest in the human accolades, his highly trained mind already fully focused on the next phase of the operational pursuit. He methodically sniffed the freshly disturbed earth, where the guerrilla fighters had frantically scrambled away from the intense firefight. The distinct, panicked scent of the fleeing insurgents was overwhelmingly powerful, creating a massive, easily readable chemical highway leading directly deeper into the impenetrable jungle. The dog looked up at his handler, his intense brown eyes clearly indicating that the dangerous enemy forces were currently vulnerable and on the run. The hunt was not over. The fundamental psychological momentum of the prolonged jungle engagement had decisively shifted entirely to the heavily armed Australian military forces. They had successfully survived the enemy's most lethal countermeasure and completely shattered their carefully constructed defensive strategy with minimal casualties. The previously elusive and highly confident Viet Cong unit was now retreating in a state of disorganized panic, their absolute reliance on jungle stealth completely shattered by the biological sensor. The Australian commander immediately ordered the platoon to rapidly reform their tactical column and forcefully press their newly acquired operational advantage against the fleeing enemy forces. Corporal Miller adjusted his heavy combat equipment and firmly gripped Caesar's sturdy leather leash, mentally preparing himself for an accelerated, highly aggressive pursuit. The failed ambush had definitively proven that the enemy was profoundly terrified of the dog and highly prone to making critical tactical errors under extreme psychological pressure. They were no longer blindly wandering through the hazardous tropical wilderness. They were actively hunting a demoralized and highly visible prey. Tom gave a subtle, silent physical command, and the Black Labrador immediately surged forward, his sensitive nose confidently leading the lethal infantry patrol back into the dense shadows. As Commander Hai frantically pushed his exhausted men deeper into the unforgiving terrain, a bitter sense of tactical defeat heavily clouded his thoughts. He had meticulously utilized every single defensive doctrine he had mastered over years of grueling guerrilla warfare, yet the unseen biological threat had completely outmaneuvered him. The terrifying reality was that his unit could no longer safely rely on static ambushes to effectively deter the relentlessly pursuing Allied forces. The tracking dog had fundamentally altered the foundational rules of their jungle combat, turning their previously secure environment into an incredibly hostile and transparent landscape. The desperate flight through the suffocating tropical undergrowth now felt increasingly like an inescapable, prolonged nightmare for the demoralized insurgent fighters. They could vividly imagine the silent, black canine systematically unraveling their complex evasive maneuvers, persistently drawing the heavily armed Australian infantrymen ever closer to their vulnerable positions. There was absolutely no safe sanctuary left within the dense Phuoc Tuy province, as long as the relentless tracking team remained operational on their trail. The stage was inevitably set for a grueling, exhaustive battle of profound physical endurance and sheer psychological terror in the deepest, darkest sections of the rainforest. The chaotic withdrawal from the failed ambush site plunged Commander Hai and his surviving guerrilla fighters into an exhausting, desperate marathon. The massive adrenaline surge that had initially fueled their frantic escape was rapidly fading, replaced by a profound, crippling physical fatigue. They recklessly crashed through dense, thorny underbrush, completely abandoning their previously established protocols of silent movement and meticulous trail obfuscation. Their singular, consuming focus was merely putting as much physical distance as possible between themselves and the terrifyingly accurate Australian tracking team, relentlessly pursuing them through the shadows. Directly behind the fleeing insurgents, Corporal Thomas Miller and his black Labrador aggressively pressed their newly acquired tactical advantage. Caesar was pulling firmly against his sturdy leather harness, his highly sensitive nose easily reading the overwhelming chemical signatures of sheer human panic and heavy physical exertion. The dog no longer needed to meticulously sweep the damp jungle floor to locate the invisible trail. The potent scent of the terrified enemy forces was hanging heavily in the stagnant tropical air. Tom practically had to jog to keep pace with the focused animal. The relentless pace of the grueling pursuit began to inflict a severe psychological toll on the heavily burdened Viet Cong soldiers. Every sudden snap of a dry twig or distant rustle of jungle foliage sent sharp, terrifying spikes of pure adrenaline coursing through their exhausted bodies. They constantly cast paranoid glances over their trembling shoulders, fully expecting to see the silent, black canine suddenly erupt from the dense emerald undergrowth. The previously comforting embrace of the thick tropical canopy now felt like a deeply oppressive, inescapable green prison, slowly closing around them. Recognizing the rapidly deteriorating mental state of his desperate men, Commander Hai forcefully ordered a brief, highly anxious tactical pause. He watched his hardened veteran fighters slump heavily against damp tree trunks, their chests heaving violently as they desperately gasped for the suffocating, humid air. "We cannot outrun a machine that feeds on our very breath, Commander," a young, exhausted soldier whispered in a trembling voice, expressing the collective dread consuming the unit. Hai grimly acknowledged the terrible truth. Their physical stamina was failing far faster than the relentless animal's terrifying olfactory endurance. Meanwhile, the heavily armed Australian infantry platoon moved with unprecedented speed and lethal operational efficiency through the complex jungle terrain. They had completely surrendered the complex navigational responsibilities to the incredible biological sensor leading their tactical column. Corporal Miller continuously monitored Caesar's physical condition, deeply concerned about the extreme heat exhaustion potentially threatening the dedicated working dog. The corporal periodically splashed warm canteen water over the Labrador's panting head, silently offering brief words of encouragement. The profound bond between the focused handler and the relentless animal was the absolute driving force of this hunt. In a frantic attempt to completely disrupt the overwhelming scent trail, Hai directed his exhausted troops into a heavily flooded mangrove swamp. The stagnant, foul-smelling water was waist-deep and incredibly difficult to navigate, severely draining the remaining physical strength of the retreating guerrilla fighters. They painstakingly waded through the treacherous, muddy obstacle for nearly an hour, desperately hoping the pungent aquatic environment would finally mask their lingering bodily odors. Hai prayed silently that the harsh, rotting vegetation would effectively overwhelm the sensitive olfactory receptors of the terrifying Australian tracking dog. When the pursuing Australian patrol eventually reached the edge of the sprawling, muddy swamp, Tom immediately halted the advancing tactical formation. He carefully unclipped Caesar's heavy tracking harness, allowing the highly trained dog a necessary moment of physical rest and essential hydration. The handler knew that deep, stagnant water presented a highly complex challenge for any tracking canine, as liquid environments rapidly diffused and degraded delicate airborne chemical signatures. He patiently waited, trusting completely in his partner's extensive operational training and preternatural ability to independently solve complex biological puzzles within the jungle. After consuming a generous amount of water, Caesar immediately returned to the muddy edge of the dark, foul-smelling tropical swamp. The intelligent Labrador did not recklessly plunge into the deep water. Instead, he began methodically pacing along the elevated, dry shoreline. His nose worked furiously, actively analyzing the subtle air currents continuously drifting across the stagnant, rotting aquatic environment. Suddenly, the dog locked onto a specific directional vector, his body tensing as he successfully caught the faint, lingering scent of the exhausted insurgents carried gently upon the humid afternoon breeze. Caesar decisively led the heavily armed Australian patrol around the treacherous outer perimeter of the massive jungle swamp. He completely bypassed the physical water obstacle, instead following the invisible chemical highway that the Viet Cong soldiers had inadvertently created while wading through the mud. The dog's incredible olfactory sensitivity allowed him to easily detect the microscopic skin cells and sweat particles resting lightly upon the surface of the stagnant water. Corporal Miller proudly reported their continued progress to the platoon commander, confirming the absolute failure of the enemy's desperate aquatic evasion tactic. Upon exiting the exhausting swamp, the demoralized guerrilla fighters realized with absolute horror that their relentless pursuers had not been deterred. The distant, methodical sounds of the heavily armed Australian infantrymen breaking through the dense foliage behind them completely shattered their fragile hopes. A profound, overwhelming sense of inevitable doom rapidly spread throughout the exhausted ranks of the Viet Cong unit. They had actively employed every single evasion technique known to their seasoned commander. Yet, the terrifying, unseen biological weapon continued to aggressively close the physical distance between them with impossible accuracy. Driven entirely by sheer desperation, several panicked guerrilla fighters hastily emptied their personal medical supplies directly onto the damp jungle trail. They frantically scattered crushed antibiotics, strong antiseptic powders, and pungent iodine solutions in a final, chaotic attempt to chemically blind the pursuing canine. This extreme measure explicitly demonstrated the absolute psychological terror inflicted by the relentless Australian tracking team. Commander Hai no longer reprimanded his troops for wasting vital medical resources. He silently understood that completely blinding the dog's terrifying nose was their only remaining chance for immediate physical survival. The strong, unnatural chemical odors briefly caused Caesar to pause his aggressive pursuit and sneeze violently, his sensitive nasal passages heavily irritated. Corporal Miller quickly dropped to his knees, using a clean piece of damp cloth to carefully wipe away the harsh medicinal powders from the dog's wet snout. He patiently allowed the Labrador to fully recover his sensory equilibrium before gently encouraging him to continue the dangerous operational assignment. Within mere moments, the highly trained animal successfully bypassed the heavily contaminated zone and confidently reacquired the pure human scent trail. The psychological weight of this final, undeniable failure completely crushed the remaining operational morale of the seasoned Viet Cong fighters. They staggered blindly through the unforgiving tropical vegetation, their physical bodies completely broken by the grueling marathon and their minds paralyzed by pure terror. They were no longer a disciplined, highly effective military unit fighting for a strategic objective. They were simply exhausted, terrified, prey frantically attempting to escape an unstoppable, invisible predator. The dense, suffocating jungle, previously their greatest tactical ally, had fundamentally transformed into an inescapable, terrifying execution chamber. As the late afternoon sun began to dip heavily below the thick jungle canopy, dark, ominous shadows rapidly lengthened across the damp terrain. Commander Hai forcefully gathered his utterly exhausted and deeply traumatized men for a final, desperately urgent tactical briefing. He looked into their hollow, terrified eyes and realized that maintaining a cohesive, unified defensive formation was currently impossible under these extreme psychological conditions. The terrifying black dog had successfully destroyed their fundamental unit cohesion without ever making physical contact or aggressively barking a single audible warning into the silent air. We must completely break our formation and scatter aggressively into the deepest sectors of the surrounding wilderness, Hai commanded in a grim, defeated whisper. He explicitly instructed his desperate men to abandon all heavy equipment and independently navigate towards secondary, highly concealed rally points scattered throughout the province. This drastic tactical dispersal was the absolute last resort of a completely defeated guerrilla force. By creating dozens of individual, conflicting scent trails, Hai desperately hoped to finally overwhelm the analytical capabilities of the terrifying biological sensor, relentlessly hunting them through the gathering darkness. The exhausted guerrilla fighters immediately scattered like frightened insects, plunging recklessly into the dense, thorny underbrush in completely random directions. They left behind their heavy canvas backpacks, excess ammunition, and any non-essential military equipment that might significantly slow their frantic individual escapes. The once highly disciplined, lethal military unit simply dissolved completely into the unforgiving tropical shadows, utterly defeated by the profound psychological terror inflicted by a single, silent animal. Their legendary reputation for supreme jungle stealth had been thoroughly and violently dismantled by the relentless Australian tracking methodology. Shortly after the desperate insurgents scattered, Corporal Miller and Caesar arrived at the chaotic, heavily trampled center of the enemy dispersal point. The Black Labrador immediately became highly agitated, his sensitive nose rapidly sweeping back and forth as he attempted to process the sudden explosion of conflicting chemical signatures. He excitedly pulled his sturdy leather harness in multiple directions simultaneously, clearly indicating that the massive, unified scent trail had abruptly shattered into numerous smaller, individual paths. The dog looked up at his dedicated handler, awaiting further specific tactical instructions. Tom carefully observed the chaotic scene, noting the significant amount of highly valuable military equipment carelessly abandoned by the fleeing enemy forces. He calmly reported the sudden tactical development to his commanding officer, confirming that the organized insurgent unit had completely disintegrated under the intense pressure of their relentless pursuit. The Australian platoon commander quickly analyzed the complex situation and made a critical operational decision. Pursuing individual, panicked guerrilla fighters through the rapidly darkening, heavily booby-trapped jungle was considered an unacceptable and entirely unnecessary tactical risk for his exhausted infantrymen. We have successfully broken their operational cohesion and captured their essential logistical supplies. The primary mission is accomplished, the commander firmly stated over the radio. He formally ordered Corporal Miller to immediately cease the aggressive tracking operation and safely consolidate his position within the newly established defensive perimeter. Tom gently pulled Caesar close, offering the exhausted, panting Labrador a final, generous drink from his aluminum canteen. The physical hunt was officially over, but the profound psychological victory achieved by the highly trained canine team was absolutely undeniable and strategically significant. The dense, terrifying silence of the Vietnamese jungle slowly returned as the heavily armed Australian patrol established their secure nighttime encampment. Corporal Miller meticulously inspected Caesar's weary paws, gently removing sharp thorns and carefully applying soothing medicinal ointment to minor cuts. He sat quietly in the oppressive darkness, profoundly aware of the incredible historical impact their silent partnership had achieved today. They had completely terrorized a seasoned enemy force and fundamentally altered the deadly rules of tropical jungle warfare. The invisible, relentless pursuit had definitively proven the absolute supremacy of the tracker dogs. The dawn broke over the dense Phuc Tu province, revealing a profoundly transformed tactical landscape following the chaotic guerrilla dispersal. Commander Hai's previously formidable military unit had been completely fractured into isolated, terrified individuals, desperately prioritizing their own physical survival. They successfully evaded immediate capture, but their operational effectiveness as a cohesive fighting force within the designated region was entirely shattered. The relentless pursuit by the Australian tracking team had forced the insurgents to completely abandon their established territorial strongholds and permanently relocate to far less strategic geographical areas. From a highly concealed position miles away, a solitary and thoroughly exhausted Commander Hai contemplated the devastating strategic implications of his unit's profound defeat. He realized with bitter clarity that the dense tropical jungle no longer provided the absolute sanctuary it once guaranteed his guerrilla fighters. The silent, terrifying biological sensor possessed by the Australian infantry had successfully penetrated their invisible shields of complex camouflage and disciplined stealth. "We are no longer the undisputed masters of these shadows. We are now the hunted," Hai admitted silently to himself. Back at the abandoned insurgent dispersal point, the heavily armed Australian platoon meticulously inventoried the significant amount of captured military equipment. They secured vital caches of enemy ammunition, medical supplies, and crucial intelligence documents carelessly discarded by the panicked guerrilla fighters during their frantic, disorganized retreat. Corporal Thomas Miller observed the organized recovery operation with a profound sense of quiet professional satisfaction. The incredible olfactory capabilities of his dedicated canine partner had unequivocally facilitated this bloodless but strategically massive military victory over a highly experienced and elusive enemy force. Upon safely returning to the fortified Nui Dat military installation, Corporal Miller and Caesar were immediately subjected to rigorous physical examinations and comprehensive operational debriefings. The immense physical toll of the grueling jungle pursuit was clearly evident on the exhausted black Labrador, requiring extensive hydration and specialized veterinary care. Tom meticulously brushed the thick mud from the dog's dark coat, gently speaking words of profound gratitude to his silent, loyal partner. He intimately understood that the animal's extraordinary biological senses had directly saved countless Australian lives during the dangerous patrol. Analyzing this engagement from a broader historical perspective, the Australian tracker dogs proved to be far more than mere biological navigational tools. They successfully evolved into an incredibly potent form of profound psychological warfare that deeply terrorized the hardened Viet Cong guerrilla forces. The insurgents were psychologically prepared to face devastating artillery barrages and overwhelming aerial bombardments, but they were utterly defenseless against an invisible, silent predator. The terrifying realization that their own microscopic bodily odors would inevitably betray their carefully concealed positions severely crippled their established operational morale. The fundamental difference between conventional military weaponry and the specialized canine tracking units lay in the profound intimacy of the sustained pursuit. A conventional artillery strike was a sudden, chaotic event, whereas the relentless tracking dog represented a slow, inescapable, and highly personalized form of lethal hunting. The persistent invisible tether connecting the exhausted guerrilla fighter to the advancing Australian infantry patrol created an unbearable, agonizing mental pressure. This profound psychological terror successfully forced highly disciplined insurgent units to make fatal tactical errors they would have otherwise easily avoided. In direct response to this devastating new tactical threat, the Viet Cong Regional Command was forced to drastically alter their established jungle warfare doctrines. They began frantically developing highly specific, lethal countermeasures explicitly designed to target and eliminate the advancing Australian tracking dogs. Insurgent forces actively deployed complex, visually deceptive booby traps, specifically calibrated for a canine's weight and predictable physical movement patterns. Despite these newly implemented, highly dangerous defensive strategies, the fundamental operational reality remained completely unchanged. Their absolute reliance on physical jungle stealth had been permanently compromised. The Australian military command structure rapidly acknowledged the immense strategic value continuously demonstrated by the dedicated tracking teams operating throughout the hostile province. They quickly integrated the specialized canine units into almost every major infantry operation, recognizing their absolute necessity for ensuring patrol security and tactical superiority. The dogs consistently provided an unparalleled, highly reliable early warning system against sophisticated enemy ambushes and deeply concealed explosive devices. This widespread tactical integration drastically reduced friendly combat casualties and significantly increased the overall operational effectiveness of the Australian Armed Forces. The incredible success of these specialized biological sensors was directly rooted in the rigorous, highly demanding training programs established back in Australia. Only the most intelligent, physically robust, and psychologically stable canines were carefully selected for this incredibly hazardous military duty. They were subjected to months of intensive, highly stressful conditioning, designed to perfect their exceptional tracking skills and ensure absolute silence during active combat operations. The meticulous preparation guaranteed that dogs like Caesar could flawlessly execute their complex tactical duties under the most extreme and terrifying battlefield conditions. Beyond the extensive professional training, the true operational power of the tracking unit stemmed directly from the profound, unbreakable bond forged between the handler and the dog. Corporal Miller and Caesar operated seamlessly as a singular, highly synchronized tactical entity, communicating flawlessly through subtle physical gestures and deeply intuitive understanding. Tom trusted the dog's highly sensitive biological radar absolutely, often completely ignoring his own limited human senses when navigating the treacherous tropical environment. This extraordinary level of mutual reliance was absolutely essential for surviving the unforgiving and deadly jungle. Sitting quietly within the secure perimeter of the military base, Tom reflected deeply on the incredible loyalty and flawless operational performance of his dedicated canine partner. Caesar had bravely faced the terrifying chaos of a sudden jungle firefight without a single moment of paralyzing hesitation or panicked vocalization. The intelligent animal simply processed the complex chemical landscape, successfully identified the lethal hidden threats, and silently guided the heavily armed infantrymen toward a decisive tactical victory. The handler gently stroked the sleeping dog, immensely proud of their shared historical achievements. Meanwhile, Commander Hai painstakingly drafted a highly detailed, sobering intelligence report for his regional superiors regarding the devastating effectiveness of the Allied tracking units. He explicitly detailed the complete failure of their traditional evasion tactics and the severe psychological trauma inflicted upon his surviving veteran troops. We must fundamentally reassess our operational capabilities in regions patrolled by these terrifying animals, Hai wrote with a heavy, deeply troubled heart. His honest, highly critical assessment officially marked the definitive end of an era for the previously unchallenged Viet Cong jungle dominance. The historical legacy of the Australian tracker dogs in the Vietnam War is characterized by their silent, highly effective, and fundamentally undeniable operational heroism. They consistently operated at the very forefront of extreme danger, bravely clearing treacherous jungle paths and deliberately walking directly into highly concealed, lethal enemy traps. These dedicated canine units successfully thwarted countless sophisticated ambushes, effectively dismantled extensive guerrilla networks, and unequivocally saved the lives of hundreds of Allied soldiers. Their unique contribution to the complex, asymmetric conflict remains a fascinating, highly respected chapter in military history. Statistical analyses of the prolonged conflict clearly illustrate the disproportionate tactical impact achieved by this relatively small, highly specialized biological force. A single, well-trained tracking team could effectively neutralize the operational camouflage of an entire guerrilla company, drastically shifting the strategic balance of power within a designated operational zone. The dogs continuously operated with an astonishing level of physical endurance and sensory precision that completely defied conventional military logic and technological limitations. They truly represented the absolute pinnacle of sophisticated biological warfare, successfully deployed within a deeply hostile tropical environment. However, the deeply poignant historical reality of these incredible military working dogs is ultimately shrouded in a profound, heartbreaking tragedy at the war's conclusion. Due to incredibly strict, inflexible national quarantine regulations, the highly decorated canine veterans were explicitly prohibited from returning to their homes in Australia. These incredibly loyal animals, who had bravely protected their human partners through unimaginable battlefield horrors, were tragically left behind or humanely euthanized when the Allied forces eventually withdrew. This devastating final sacrifice adds a deeply somber, highly emotional layer to their extraordinary historical legacy. During his active combat deployment, Corporal Miller occasionally allowed himself to worry intensely about the uncertain, highly precarious future awaiting his dedicated canine partner. He forcefully pushed these dark, deeply troubling thoughts from his mind, choosing instead to focus entirely on their immediate physical survival within the dangerous jungle. He was absolutely determined to protect Caesar with the same fierce, unwavering loyalty that the Black Labrador continuously demonstrated during their highly stressful tactical patrols. Their profound connection transcended the brutal realities of war, representing a pure, enduring alliance. Ultimately, a strange, unspoken mutual respect was forged within the brutal crucible of the unforgiving tropical jungle between the opposing military forces. The Viet Cong fighters profoundly hated and deeply feared the relentlessly pursuing Australian tracker dogs, but they also genuinely respected their incredible, undeniable biological capabilities. The silent, black canines had successfully forced the heavily entrenched guerrilla forces to fundamentally adapt their complex warfare strategies, proving themselves to be incredibly formidable battlefield adversaries. The jungle itself became a deeply contested territory, forever altered by this unique tactical dynamic. Commander Hai eventually managed to carefully rebuild a significantly smaller, highly cautious guerrilla unit, but his overall strategic perspective had been permanently changed. He never again underestimated the terrifying sensory capabilities of the Allied tracking teams, always assuming that an invisible, highly accurate biological tether could be silently attached to his men at any moment. The profound psychological scars, inflicted by the relentless, silent pursuit, would permanently haunt his operational decisions for the remainder of the brutal conflict. The shadow of the Australian dog was an ever-present, terrifying reality. For Corporal Thomas Miller and his faithful partner Caesar, the grueling operational routine of the dangerous tropical war continued without significant interruption. They consistently led heavily armed infantry columns deep into the dense, suffocating emerald foliage, constantly searching for the faint, invisible chemical signatures of the elusive enemy forces. The iconic, historical image of the highly focused handler, carefully walking directly behind his silent, intently sniffing black Labrador, perfectly encapsulates their extraordinary contribution. They remain the undisputed, highly respected masters of the complex, deadly biological hunt in the jungle. The compelling story of the Australian tracker dog serves as a powerful, highly enduring testament to the incredible ingenuity and vital adaptability required in modern warfare. They brilliantly transformed a fundamental human vulnerability into an overwhelming tactical advantage, utilizing the incredible power of nature to decisively combat a highly elusive, incredibly dangerous enemy force. Their silent, heroic legacy continues to be deeply honored by military historians and dog handlers alike, permanently securing their highly respected place as one of the most uniquely effective special forces in military history.